Hey, everybody. Welcome to day 2 of our special course, a crash course on worldview and culture. Glad to be back with you. I had a great time yesterday with so many of you. Thanks for the interaction. Got tons and tons and tons of great questions, and keep those questions coming in. I'm going to bring Brett on here in just a second as we kind of continue to work through some of the technical things. I wanted to just give a couple more housekeeping details. The first is that I understand that while the email with yesterday's course was sent to everyone who had signed up for the course before, went to a different list, and as we're kind of maxing out the system, we're finding some of the troubleshooting things that we need to do. So for example, yesterday when we began the course and I heard this voice coming through and wondering what happened, it was actually our speaker today, Brett. Brett actually was speaking, but that's a whole long story and kind of funny, and I'm going to give him a hard time about it. Hey, just like yesterday, though, we're going to do we're going to sing questions, 2 different questions. If you have a technical question, in other words, something's not working out, and we can help you troubleshoot the chat box, which is down below. But the questions having to do with the content of the course, type into the Q&A box, and Brett's going to try to follow those, maybe address some of those as he's teaching, and then I'm going to try to curate that and all the questions that come in while he's speaking and beyond, and we'll try to have a really productive Q&A time for the last 30 minutes. He's going to speak for about 45 minutes, and then we'll take questions for about 30 minutes and keep this to an hour and 15. And you'll get an email with this video and with the course resources and the links to anything that Brett mentions in today's course a little bit later on. So hopefully it'll continue to bless. We've heard from so many people. In fact, we had, I think, attendees from like 6 different countries yesterday, and beyond that weren't able to join us live. So it was really tremendous. Really excited about the way this is going and excited to get these resources out to you. Let me open with prayer. I'll introduce Brett and we'll get started. Father, thanks for this time virtually together. The gift of technology is something that blesses our lives and also challenges us, as we'll talk about even further on Thursday. And at the same time, we're glad to have a chance to think together and learn together. Give Brett clarity and articulation as he communicates things that matter. And we commit this time to you, and also ask you to guide this technology and hold it together in your grace as we try to learn together here. In Christ's name, amen. Well, pleased to introduce my co-host for this course and my good friend, Brett Kunkle. Brett and I co-authored the book, A Practical Guide to Culture, as well as the Student Guide to Culture, which just came out in January. And by the way, I mentioned yesterday that kind of picking up those books would be a great preparation and a follow-up to this course. Amazon, of course, is limiting all deliveries that are non-essential, but you can still get the Kindle version of it immediately. And if you want to get the actual book shipped to you quicker, you might want to go. In fact, I would encourage you to go to CBD, Christian Book Distributors. They're shipping right away, and then it can get to you that way. But Brett is the founder and the president of Maven. Maven is an organization that's helping students and their parents really grasp that which is true, good, and beautiful for a life of service to the kingdom. And it's a terrific organization. He'll tell you more about this as we go along. It's been a pleasure to partner with Brett on a number of things. So Brett, I am going to hand it off to you. I'm going to go blank here, and then let me know when you're ready to go with Q&A.
All right. Thanks, John. Technology is a huge gift, isn't it, that we can do this? Actually, I just want to encourage my co-author there, maybe to get updated on technology. I was watching him yesterday, and I noticed this white thing hanging down his side of his face. I was like, "Is that a wire?" I'm like, "John, come on, that's a wire. Wires are so 2015, buddy." And I don't want to flex on John, but notice the wireless earpods there. So I'll help my co-host here get up to the 2020s here. But anyway, glad you guys are able to join us here on technology. If you have a Bible, if you have a Bible with you right now, turn to Colossians chapter 2, verses 2 through 3. if you're sitting there watching and you don't have a Bible in front of you, why are you still sitting there? Get up, go get your Bible, all right, and turn to Colossians chapter 2, verses 2 through 3. And I want to read to you this passage, and then I've got a question for you. So Colossians chapter 2, 2 through 3, Paul writes the following. He says, my goal is that they may be encouraged in heart and united in love, so that they may have the full riches of complete understanding, in order that they may know the mystery of God, namely Christ, in whom are hidden all the treasures of wisdom and knowledge. Okay, here's my question. I want you to focus in on that last section. Christ, in whom are hidden all the treasures of wisdom and knowledge. In Christ are hidden all. That word all means all. It means everything. In Christ are hidden all the treasures of wisdom and knowledge. So here's the question. As a Christian, do you really believe that? Do you really believe that in Christ are hidden all treasures of wisdom and knowledge? Now, of course, we know what's the right Christian answer. Yes. Oh, yeah, I believe that, right? Well, that's what we're supposed to say. But I'm not sure most Christians actually truly believe that. And I think there's a concept that we have to understand in order to really know whether or not we can answer that question in the affirmative. If we can answer it, yes. So here's the concept you need to understand. Worldview. You need to understand the concept of worldview. Now, what is worldview? Worldview is your picture of reality. That's just a simple definition for worldview. It's your picture of reality. All right, I'm going to pause here. I'm going to stop sharing my screen because I think you guys are seeing the presenter view here. Let me restart the, there we go. Is that, I'm going to get a little technical help here. Can you get the, okay, well, I get some technical help here so that you guys can get the full screen of my PowerPoint. Worldview. What is a worldview? Simply defined, it's your picture of reality. Okay. Guess what? Everyone has a worldview, right? Everyone has a picture of reality. It's how you see the world. It's all the beliefs and the ideas that you use to interpret everything that you see and experience. Okay. All right. I think we got the technical stuff taken care of. Okay. We're back. Worldview, picture of reality. Okay. Now, for most of us, all right, I want to use an analogy here that will help you understand this concept of worldview a little bit better. So you've got this picture of reality, right? It's made up of all your ideas and your beliefs that you're kind of floating in your mind. Now, think about a puzzle, right? If I take a puzzle and I dump all the puzzle pieces out on the table, it's going to look like this. This is actually how probably most of our minds look. If we were to take all of the ideas and beliefs that we hold in our mind, they are scattered, they are disconnected puzzle pieces, right? And so they don't fit together. They haven't been fit together yet. There's no what we would call coherence, where the ideas and beliefs don't make sense yet. They don't make they don't give us the big picture. And so many of us, even though we have a worldview, it's scattered, it's inconsistent, it's not reasonable. And so this is what most of us look like. When we do some good worldview thinking, here's what happens. Those disconnected pieces get put in the proper place. And what happens? A coherent picture forms, a picture of the world forms that makes sense of all of this stuff. That's what a worldview helps us to do. It helps us to make sense of all the stuff of life. Now think about this. Human beings are the only kinds of beings that ask, the why questions, that seek to make sense of the world. This is utterly unique to human beings. Why? Why do we demand explanations for things? Why do we want explanations? Well, because we are the only rational creature on this planet. In fact, some of you are probably sitting there. Maybe your dog is sitting in the house with you, and look over at your dog or look over at your cat or your hamster, if you're crazy enough to have a hamster. Look at the animals around you. I guarantee you that right now, your animal, your pet, is not trying to work out the world in their mind. They're not trying to make sense of the world. Your dog is not laying there pondering the nature of his existence. Your dog is not asking, what does it mean to be a dog? He's not wondering about the purpose of his life because he's not a rational creature. Animals are not rational creatures. So this idea of trying to make sense of life, trying to figure out worldview, answering the big questions, getting an explanation for everything is utterly unique to human beings. We are the only rational creature. Now, when we try to make sense of the world, as we've been doing for thousands and thousands of years, there are a list of 5 universal questions that human beings have always asked. These are what you might call the 5 big worldview questions. In fact, if you do have a copy of the book, in the Student's Guide to Culture, we list these 5 worldview questions on page 54, and kind of 53, 54, 55, and through 57 is a section on worldview in the student guide. In the practical guide, the 5 worldview questions are listed on page 91. So check that out. You can do some more reading on worldview there. Now, here are the 5 big worldview questions. Number 1, there's the question of origin. This is the question of where did everything come from? Or why is there something rather than nothing? How did it all begin? Any adequate worldview that's going to explain the world that we live in has got to answer that question. Then there's the question of identity. Okay, what does it mean to be human? Who am I? What am I? Right? This is the question of identity. There's the question of meaning. Okay, why am I here? What's the purpose of all this? Is there any purpose? Or is it all purposeless, meaningless? Right? There's the question of morality. How should I live my life? Is there a right and wrong? Are there right and wrong choices? Is there even such a thing as right and wrong? How do we know that kind of stuff? And then there's the final question of destiny. What happens when I die? These are the 5 big worldview questions. And any adequate worldview has got to give us answers to those 5 fundamental questions to help us make sense of this world. Now, think about it. Go back to the puzzle analogy. If you are going to put together a puzzle and you dump all those pieces out on the table, what are you going to start with to really help you put that puzzle piece together? Right? Which pieces are you going to start with? Which pieces will you start putting together first? Okay, raise your hand if you know the answer. Yeah, okay, Johnny right there in the front row. Okay, yeah, no, obviously I can't see you. Although I bet there's a parent out there going, wait, can he see us? All right. No, the right answer is the edges, right? You are going to start with the edges in order to kind of frame out that puzzle. You start with the edges because what the edges do is they begin to, they'll make sense of what's going to be inside. So in the same way, that's what a worldview does for us. A worldview frames reality. It makes sense of reality. See, we have all these all these disconnected pieces for many of us, right? So you could take a topic like sexuality or work, what we do for a living, or job, or education, or technology, or psychology, whatever, all the stuff of life. You put that in the middle, and if it's not framed well, just like the edges of that puzzle piece, if you don't have that frame, it's hard to make sense of the individual pieces. So what does a worldview do? Well, a good worldview frames that for us to help us make sense of all those things. And what's the frame? The frame are those 5 big key worldview questions. When you can answer the question of origin, identity, meaning, morality, destiny, this then will help frame all the other stuff. It will make sense. It'll bring coherence of the other issues in life. This is why a worldview is so important for us. It helps us to see reality properly, and it frames life for us. Okay, so that's a quick introduction to the concept of worldview and how it frames the world for us. Now, here's what I want to do. I want to kind of give you a quick overview of 3 major worldviews that are out there. And then I want to connect the idea of worldview and the ideas that we hold, the ideas we have about reality to real life. Because oftentimes this conversation is a very abstract conversation. And I want you to see that worldview really matters. Okay, so let's categorize the major worldviews out there. Now, this isn't a comprehensive, exhaustive list, but this is, I think, a good place to start. All right, you have the worldview of theism. Theism can simply be defined this way: God made all, right? A theistic worldview is the view that there's some personal, powerful creator who made everything and is somehow distinct from what he's made. Now, there are 3 kind of great religions, great monotheistic religions out there. What would those be? The 3 great monotheistic religions are Judaism, Islam, and Christianity, right? And so notice there are even subcategories within the larger worldview. All 3 of those religions are theistic worldviews. They all have a view that God is the creator of all things. Now, do they differ? Absolutely. They differ in very fundamental ways, in contradictory ways. But the point is they're all theistic. So they actually do have some similarities as well. All right, so that's the theistic worldview. God made all. Now, of course, that's not the only view. There is what we call pantheism. Theos meaning God, pan meaning all. So this is the view that God is all. That means God is not separate from what he's made, but he is in everything. Now, I'm sure you're familiar with that, the classic Star Wars movies. I mean, everyone is, right? Isn't everyone a Star Wars fan? But when you watch Star Wars, now you're not going to be able to hear the audio on this, but I'll show you the clips. When you listen to this guy, Obi-Wan Kenobi, or you listen to the other great Jedi Master, Yoda, right? And they explain the Force. What do they say? They say, the Force is in all of us. It binds the universe together. And in this scene in Star Wars with Luke Skywalker, Yoda says, the Force is in you. It's in me. It's in the rock. It's in the tree. And that is a pantheistic worldview. So even pantheism gets into Star Wars. It gets into pop culture. Here's what I want you to see, is that these worldviews don't stay up here in the realm of ideas. They trickle down into the culture, into pop culture, into our entertainment. And what you have in the Star Wars universe is a worldview, a pantheistic worldview that says God, or the Force, right? That's the language that's used, is in all of us. And we are actually all part of the same thing, and we are all connected that way. And eventually my individuality gets swallowed up in this larger force, this thing. It's not so God is not a personal being. It's an impersonal force. Now, if you think, oh, come on, let's not get too serious about something like Star Wars. Well, look, George Lucas is pretty serious about this stuff. George Lucas says this. He says, Star Wars is designed primarily to make young people think about the mystery. Not to say, here's the answer. It's to say, think about this for a second. Is there a God? What does God look like? What does God sound like? What does God feel like? How do we relate to God? See, as a movie maker, he's interested in exploring the big worldview questions. Is there a God? What does he look like? What does he sound like? What does he feel like? See, he was interested in getting a worldview out there. And so you've got George Lucas communicating worldview ideas through the medium of entertainment. And the idea, of course, in Star Wars is that God is in all. It's actually some impersonal force. Okay, so you got theism, God made all. You got pantheism, God is all. And then the third major worldview is atheism. There is no God at all, right? Meaning no or non, theos meaning God, no God. There's no God. Hey, the physical world is all that exists. The material universe is all that exists. And this worldview was captured very well by a kind of a popularizer of science, a scientist himself, Carl Sagan. He was a prominent astronomer, astrophysicist, but he was really good at popularizing science. He wrote a book called Cosmos I believe, in 1980. He says that it's kind of a famous line from his book. He says the cosmos is all that is, or ever was, or ever will be. That is a great summary of atheism. The universe, the material universe, is all that is, was, or ever will be. That's it. There's no supernatural. Everything's just, it's the natural world. End of story. There's nothing supernatural, no gods, no angels, no souls, things like that. All right, so that's atheism. Now, again, is this just an abstract idea that, university professors think about? No, these ideas trickle into the culture. In fact, how many of you have ever read the Berenstain Bears? Anyone read that? Yeah, you're all sinners. Okay. No, just kidding. We have Berenstain Bears books here in our home. But if you get the Bears Nature Guide, you're going to get a little dose of atheism or of naturalism, kind of a subset of atheism. Here is, if you open up the book, you start reading, here is what the Berenstain Bears are going to teach you. Nature is every person, thing, and place here on Earth and out in space. Nature's the sun, the moon, the stars. It's faraway planets like Venus and Mars. It's the mountains, the valleys, the shore, the sea. Nature is you. Nature is me. And then you open up the very last page of the Berenstain Bears Nature Guide, and this is what you see. It's all that is or was or ever will be. Sound familiar? Yeah. All right, there you go. There's Carl Sagan, the atheist. His ideas, his phrase in the Berenstain Bears. So these ideas trickle down into the culture. And that's such a key thing to understand when it comes to worldviews. As John and I write in the book, ideas have consequences. These ideas matter because they have consequences. And bad ideas have victims. So if you come to embrace false ideas and you live those false ideas out, there will be consequences. There will be pain. There will be hurt. And so worldview really matters. Okay, now let's play this out a little bit more. Let's take those worldviews. We've got theism, pantheism, and atheism, right? And just for sake of time, we're going to take pantheism off the table. We're going to focus on theism and atheism, right? And those are two worldviews that are kind of battling for the hearts and minds of people in our culture, in Western culture. Okay, now let's take the 5 big worldview questions and let's compare and contrast the answers that they offer. And I think this will help illustrate how these answers really matter and why you and I need to think very carefully about worldview. So let's take the first question, the origin question. Where does everything come from? And let's start with atheism. How do atheists answer this question? Now, we're going to let the atheists speak for themselves. We're not going to put words in their mouth, but these atheists are pretty prominent atheists that I'm going to quote from, and they represent a lot of what, mainstream atheists believe. So this would be Quentin Smith. Now, he's a smart atheist, smart guy. He's deceased now, but he's a former professor of philosophy at Western Michigan University. Here's his summary of the answer to the origin question. He said the most reasonable belief is that we came from nothing, by nothing, and for nothing. All right, we came from nothing, by nothing, and for nothing. So in the beginning, there was nothing. And then somehow we got everything. I mean, that would be his view. Lawrence Krauss is a theoretical physicist. He was at Arizona State University, got into some trouble, but wrote a book called A Universe from Nothing. A Universe from Nothing. That's the title of the book. The subtitle, if you can see it there, is Why There Is Something Rather Than Nothing. Now, of course, when you read his book, what you're going to find is he's proposing to give an explanation of the universe, getting a universe from nothing, right? So getting something from nothing. Turns out, when you actually read what he's saying, nothing actually is something. That's called cheating. He just changes the definition of nothing. You know what a good definition of nothing is? No thing whatsoever. All right, that's what nothing is. No thing whatsoever. It's what rocks dream about. Think about that. All right, now here is what Krauss says. And this is actually in a YouTube video where he's giving a lecture on this idea. He says, the amazing thing is that every atom in your body comes from a star that exploded. And the atoms in your left hand probably came from a different star than your right hand. It really is the most poetic thing I know about physics. You are all stardust. You couldn't be here if stars hadn't exploded, because the elements, the carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, iron, all the things that matter for evolution, weren't created at the beginning of time. They were created in the nuclear furnaces of stars. And the only way they could get into your body is if those stars were kind enough to explode. So forget Jesus. The stars died so that you could be here today. All right. So what is he trying to do? This atheist, Lawrence Krauss, is trying to answer the question of origin. We all came from stars that had to die for us. All right. So you've got some atheist answers there. Now, there are other possible atheist explanations out there, but these represent some of the big ones. Okay. Basically, you get something from nothing, right? So that's the atheist origin story. Now, let's contrast that with theism, particularly with Christian theism. As a Christian, let's explore the Christian answers here. What's our answer to the question of where do we come from? Well, we might point back to Scripture, right? We might point back to the very first verse of the Bible, Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Right. And so a lot of Christians are going to say, yeah, there's the answer. Now, let me just kind of take a little rabbit trail here. I want you to notice how in our culture now, how this is going to sound if we make a simple appeal to the Bible. Right. So you got the atheist over here. What's he appealing to? Reason and science. Right. You got reason and science over here. Then a lot of Christians, we come in and we say, well, no, the Bible says this, and it looks like it's the Bible versus science. It's the Bible versus rationality. If you want to be scientific and reasonable and rational, hey, you got to go over here. If you want to have that faith stuff, well, then you go with the Bible. Okay, that's fine. If that's your personal private belief, no problem. But don't try to claim that it's actually true or something like that. All right. Well, let me clarify our view on this. Okay, we don't take the Bible to simply be some nice story. We don't take it to be a kind of a legendary book, or it's got some good moral stories, but there's a lot of mythology in there, or it's all allegorical. We just got to interpret it a certain way. In fact, Sean's going to talk about the authority of Scripture tomorrow and our view of the Bible, but really, our view of the Bible is that the Bible gives us knowledge of reality. And there's good reason to think that, but the Bible gives us knowledge of reality. So just as science is a way to know reality, the Bible gives us knowledge of reality. And so when it comes to this origin question, I don't want you to feel like, oh gosh, now it's science against the Bible, and science, of course, in the culture is always going to win that. No, our claims, let's clarify our claims. Our claims are reasonable claims. They're claims about reality, and they can be backed up. In fact, listen to what Paul says in Romans chapter 1, verses 19 and 20. He says, since what may be known about God is plain to them because God has made it plain to them. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made. so that men are without excuse. So what is Paul saying here? He's saying that God's existence is evident in the natural world. We can get evidence of God's existence in the natural world. Science helps us to understand the natural world. So science can give us evidence of God's existence. So here's our answer to the origin question. God exists. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. This is a claim. When we say God exists, it's not just a personal claim or personal belief. This is a claim about the nature of reality. Let's be very clear on that. I'm not saying that I merely believe in God. The Christian worldview isn't just saying, oh, well, we believe in God. The Christian worldview is making a claim about reality. And the claim is, hey, there is a God who exists, whether you believe in him or not. And guess what? There's evidence for that. So this is where in the history of Christianity, we have apologists, people who have defended the faith, have given rational answers to these kinds of questions, who have given evidence to back up our answers. And so you have arguments for God's existence, like the cosmological argument, the fine-tuning argument, the design argument, the moral argument, the argument from consciousness, the ontological argument, and on and on and on. There's a half a dozen solid, good arguments for God's existence. All right, now, so I want to make it clear that the Christian worldview is not just faith and that the atheist worldview is science and logic. No, we're both making truth claims that we can argue using rationality and science. Okay, now, but again, my point isn't to argue for the truth or falsity of a view yet. What I want you to see just is this comparison between these worldviews. So in the atheistic worldview, when it comes to the question of origin, where do we come from? The atheist answer, let's get clear on what the atheist answer is. For many atheists, it's going to be the universe came into existence from no one, out of nothing, and for no reason, right? That's the atheistic origin story. Now, contrast that with theism, particularly Christian theism. The universe was brought into existence by a personal, powerful creator outside of the natural realm, outside of the cosmos, for a purpose. Now, are those two very different answers to the question of where we come from? Absolutely. All right. Now let's go back. Let's take this this first big worldview question of origin, and let's go back to that analogy of the puzzle. Right. So we're kind of fitting the pieces of the puzzle together, but notice what we're trying to build are the edges to start framing the rest of reality, the rest of life. So you and I find ourselves in this current moment. John talked about this a little bit yesterday. We live in a cultural moment. This is our moment right now, 21st century, okay, 2020, the coronavirus, right? This is our cultural moment. And there are all kinds of cultural moments in our lifetime. Now, oftentimes Christians only look at the moment. We look at all the challenges. We look at maybe all the bad stuff. Sometimes Christians, we have a bad habit of just looking at the bad stuff. We see all the evil, and there's plenty of it out there. But a lot of Christians, and I would say this particularly, I think, to the older generation, maybe who long for the quote unquote good old days, right? There's often a tone, an attitude of despair, a posture of despair when they look at the current cultural moment. And they see all the bad things. They see all the things that the political party that they don't like or they don't identify with is doing, and they despair. All right, let's think about this now. Number one, is despair a good strategy? No, it's not a good strategy. And number two, it is not appropriate for someone whose worldview is a Christian worldview, who at the center of their worldview is Jesus Christ, right? As followers of Jesus, despair is not an option for us. Is it wrong to be sad, to be upset about things, to even mourn the things that happen in our culture? No, of course not. Not saying that. But despair is different than just sadness or mourning. Despair is kind of like giving up, right? And lacking hope, feeling hopeless. That's not an option. In fact, in the book, John and I give an analogy here, and it is on, let's see, what page is that on? Give you the page here. Page 41 and 42 of A Practical Guide to Culture. Page 41 and 42. Here's the analogy, the illustration to kind of illustrate how this is not a good way to proceed as Christians who have a worldview and who live in culture. Let's say you're talking to someone who's reading the book, The Fellowship of the Ring, right? And I'm sure many of you have read it. And if you haven't read it, you've watched the movies. If you haven't, spoiler alert. Okay. Spoiler is coming here. Let's say you get into that first book of that trilogy, The Fellowship of the Ring. You know, and you're reading through that and it's just a compelling story and you get connected to the fellowship who's gathered. And now they start off on this journey to take the ring to Mordor, to help Frodo get the ring and destroy it in Mordor. And you get to the scene of where the fellowship is in the mines of Moria, right? In the mines of Moria. And, you know, you get towards the end of that scene, and what happens? Well, you know, they're confronted with this massive creature, the Balrog, this evil creature, and he's threatening the fellowship. And what does Gandalf do? Gandalf, this character who you've come to love, the wise one, the powerful one, you know, he's this amazing character. He stands between the fellowship and this evil Balrog. And what does he do? He tries to take the Balrog down, right? Defeats the Balrog. No, he doesn't. What happens? Gandalf gets taken down. And Gandalf dies. Now imagine you're at this point in the story. You've read up to this point. You fall in love with Gandalf. You love his character. And then Tolkien, this author, kills him, and you, at that point, shut the book and say, I'm done. What an idiot. What? I can't believe this author just killed off maybe the best character in the entire book. And you throw the book down and you say, I am not reading anymore. Now, for those of us who have continued to read and know the end of the story, what would we say? We'd say, no, you can't stop reading there. You're confusing this one moment with the larger story. Don't confuse the moment and the story. Because when you read that entire story, when you see how it ends, what you discover is that Gandalf the Gray comes back. And he's now Gandalf the White, and he's more powerful than ever. And ultimately, good triumphs over evil. So we would tell you, don't stop. Don't just focus on that one moment. No, you've got to put that one moment into a larger story. That's what a worldview helps us to do. We live in this cultural moment, but this cultural moment is just one moment of a number of cultural moments, many of those that we haven't lived ourselves, that others have lived. And it starts with the beginning of time and goes till the end of time. There's a larger story, or what we might call the story of reality, as my friend Greg Kunkle has put it in his book, The Story of Reality. Great book. And what we have is a story of the real world, what really goes on here. And now, in the Christian worldview, right, we start with that origin question. The creation. So in the books, John and I break the 4 chapters of the Christian story, or we break this Christian story into 4 chapters: creation, the fall, redemption, restoration. And now notice how these correspond with the worldview questions. Creation, Genesis 1 helps us to answer where we came from. It also starts getting into the question of identity. Genesis 1, 26 and 27. Right? And we'll get to that in a little bit. Now, Genesis 3, like any good story, shows us the conflict. There's conflict. There's a problem. Genesis 3 is the fall, This is where sin and death corrupt the world, and the world is broken. Okay, what happens? Well, we got chapter 3 after that, redemption. There's a hero to this story. And through Jesus, God is now reconciling the world back to himself. He's redeeming things. And ultimately, and so that's the chapter we're in right now, right? We are in chapter 3. We're in the redemption chapter. Now, there's one more chapter coming. And now in the redemption chapter, that tells us, it answers the questions of meaning and morality. What am I here for? What's the purpose of this life? How should I live? The chapter of redemption really fills that out for us. And then lastly, the 4th chapter answers the question of our destiny. Where is this all going? And ultimately, God will return, Christ will return, and he will restore all things. Okay. And so for Christians, here's the insight. Let's step back here. Okay. What are we saying? We're saying we don't start with the moment. We start with the larger story. That's where we start. What's the larger story? Story is just another word to capture the idea of worldview. We start with the Christian worldview. We don't start with the coronavirus. We don't start with the evil things that are happening in the world. We don't lose hope and we don't despair. No, we put all of that into the larger Christian worldview that's going to frame it for us. And yes, there's some bad stuff going on. And yes, there's evil. And yes, there are horrible things. And yes, people die. And those are bad things. But those are to be expected in the Christian worldview because we live in a fallen world. But we know that's not the end of the story. And so actually, now notice how worldview can help us live in this moment. We don't live in fear. We don't live in fear of death, right? Because we know that this life is not all there is. And God can actually use the bad things of this world to bring redemption to the world. It wakes up the world to see there are things that are much more important and bigger, and that ultimately one day God will return and he will restore it all. He'll wipe away all that evil. So that's why we start with the story, and that's how our Christian worldview helps us to then live in this cultural moment. Okay, let me kind of go through the question of identity, and we'll kind of wrap this up, and then we'll take some questions. But let's take, again, theism and atheism as these two competing worldviews. Let's look at how they answer the identity question, and let's look at how those answers really matter. Okay, so the identity question is, what does it mean to be human? Who are we? What are we? All right, here's the answer according to a prominent atheist. Now, guy named George Gaylord Simpson wrote a book called The Meaning of Evolution. This is like late 1960s, but I think his statement from his book is just a great summary of the answer to the atheistic, a good summary of the atheistic answer to the question of identity. Man is the result of a purposeless and natural process that did not have him in mind. Okay, there you go. Man is the result of a purposeless and natural process that did not have him in mind. So this is kind of answering some of that origin question, the implications of their origin question, the answer to their origin question. We come from nothing, by nothing, for nothing. So therefore, we are the result of a purposeless and natural process that did not even think about us, that does not care about us, right? In fact, I was in an airport a couple of years ago, and I was walking past one of those bookstores and saw a magazine rack, and I saw this big title of this magazine, Evolution. Discover Magazine presents Evolution. And I'm like, oh, I got to go check that out. So I walk over to the magazine rack, pick up the magazine. I'm looking at the cover. I snapped the picture. Here's the picture. And notice, I want to draw your attention to one headline that's on the front of this magazine. It's up there in the, I think, see for you, should be the left-hand corner. All right. From ooze to us. Okay. Now that is the description by this is a pro-evolution magazine. This is their description. This is not like us, us Christians kind of making them look silly. This is their explanation of their origin story. and what a human being is. Our origin comes from ooze to us, some primordial soup, the process of macroevolution. Eventually you get us. Okay. There is a great video clip. You can probably find it on YouTube of Bill Nye, the science guy. And he's giving a lecture. And if you listen to his lecture, he talks about being a speck. He says, I'm a speck. The earth is a speck. We're in this kind of cosmic specklessness. And in this video, he says, I suck. I'm nothing. I suck. So atheist Bill Nye, trying to use science, says science tells us that we're really nothing. We are insignificant. This is Ingrid Newkirk. She is the former president and co-founder of PETA, which is the world's largest animal rights organization. An atheist. Notice how she then begins to kind of cash this out, these ideas, right, in terms of forming an answer to this identity question. She says this: animal liberationists do not separate out the human animal, right? So folks like her with their worldview don't make a distinction between animals and humans. So she says, so there is no rational basis for saying that a human being has special rights. A rat is a pig, is a dog, is a boy. They are all mammals. So what does she do? She takes all those mammals and puts them on the same level. There's no supremacy of human beings. There's no greater value of human beings. Okay, now that fits with the atheist worldview. If we're all, if there's no purpose to all this, if there's no creator, if we are some kind of the result of some purposeless process that didn't think about us, that just kind of spit us out and coughed us up, well, this seems to be consistent with that. Okay, now, okay, here's the connection. I always want you to connect worldview with real life. Do the ideas get played out? Yes. Let me show you a scene from 2016 in the Cincinnati Zoo. Okay, in the Cincinnati Zoo, you've got this guy. How many of you out there know who this guy is? I guess the guy, I'm talking about the gorilla. Famous gorilla. Everyone out there is saying at the same time, Harambe, right? Harambe became probably one of the most famous memes of all time. But what happened in this scene here? This little 4-year-old boy falls over into the gorilla enclosure in the Cincinnati Zoo. Harambe, this big, rare silverback gorilla, male silverback gorilla, goes and he grabs the boy and he takes him around the pen for about 10 minutes. Zookeepers, of course, rush over. They're trying to decide what to do within 10 minutes for the safety of the boy. This gorilla can crush this boy in a second. So what do? They shoot Harambe. They kill him. All right. Now, it was interesting following the cultural conversation after this and to hear the discussions that were happening. They were worldview discussions, and they helped us see how people answer this question of identity. Okay. And so Bron Taylor, who's writing in the Huffington Post, he's a professor of religion and nature, University of Florida. He writes this, so publicly for everyone to read. He's addressing this issue because there's this uproar about killing this rare silverback gorilla. And so he says, some environmental philosophers and scientists, however, contend that an individual member of an endangered species is more valuable than an individual human being. The value of an individual decreases proportionately with the size of its population. So what he's doing is saying, hey, let's re-examine human value and animal value. He says, well, we might use a different system. We shouldn't just assume that human beings are more valuable. And he goes on to say, why do we think this? He says, our reactions to the value of humans and other animals are typically shaped by culturally deep religious roots. Okay, if you think human beings are more valuable than animals, that's just because you got this religious hangover. It's this Christianity stuff that's kind of shaped our culture. And ultimately, what does he say? We got to get over it. He says this: perhaps this case of Harambe will help those who are skeptical of those religious ideas that undergird human supremacy to leave them behind once and for all. Let's get rid of that idea that humans are better. It may be that corresponding conservation policies and efforts would follow if such a, notice what he says here, value transformation spreads. He wants to transform our values, that we think human beings are somehow special. He says this: I hope that zoos will soon and universally be on the leading edge of this transformation, rather than reinforcing ancient and self-serving human conceits. So zoos are going to lead us in this value transformation. Right? Here he is, a PhD, right? Smart guy. And what's he saying? He is laying out for us a view of human identity and human value. By the way, let me pause here. I think I'm getting some background noise. I think I'm hearing John, or I don't know if that's you, John, I can hear. But all right. So now let's connect this with real life. Think about it. Here's the important question. When it comes to identity and what we are, what makes us valuable? What makes a human being valuable? If you have a worldview without God, on what basis do you measure human value? You're going to have to point to some characteristic to measure human value. So here's how it works in our culture. In fact, if you're a high schooler or a junior higher or a college student out there listening right now, this should hit home for you. Think about that question. What makes other high schoolers or other junior hires or middle schoolers on your campus? What does everyone see in terms of their value? What do they look for to say this person is valuable? Now, it's obvious for you guys. You see it all day, every day, that some people are considered more valuable than other people. So what do they point to? They point to things like beauty, good looks. If you're a pretty girl, you're more popular. If you're a good looking guy, you're more popular. Or maybe it's smarts, maybe it's intelligence. You're in AP classes, you're on your way to a top university. Well, gosh, your value is going to raise in the eyes of others. Or maybe it's your wealth, how much money you have or your family has, or what car you drive, or what kind of clothes you wear. People will point to that and, oh, if you're more wealthy, well, then you're going to have more value and we're going to treat you as more valuable. Or maybe it's your physical ability. Maybe it's you're a good athlete. You're a top athlete in your school. Well, guess what? Your value's up here. You're going to be more popular, right? And so we look at these different characteristics and we base value on those things, because in an atheistic worldview where there is no God, there's nothing that we share equally. And so then the things that we're going to point to then, think about it: beauty, smarts, wealth, physical ability. Do we share any of those things equally? No, we have those in unequal portions. I might look at my good friend John Stonestreet and say, hey, physical ability, man, I'm a way better athlete than that guy. John might look at me and go, dude, I'm way smarter than him. All right. Now, look, we don't share those things equally. And so there's no basis for human equality in an atheistic worldview, in a godless worldview. Now let's contrast that with the Christian worldview that says what? Genesis chapter 1, 26 and 27, that human beings are made in God's image. It's what we refer to as the imago Dei, the image of God. Guess what? The only thing that every one of us shares equally is that we are made in God's image. We don't have more or less of God's image. We share that equally. And guess what? That becomes the proper basis for equal value. Why are we all equally valuable? No matter what our intelligence is, no matter what our good looks are, we are all equally valuable, not based on any of those characteristics, but because we're made in God's image. And this makes us dignified. We're equally dignified. We have equal dignity and we have equal rights because we're all made in God's image. And so the Christian worldview is the only worldview that gives us a proper basis for human equality. Now, of course, that's not the end of the story. There's some bad news on this when it comes to human identity. What does it mean to be human? We're made in God's image. We're beautiful. We're dignified, but we are also broken. Beautiful, but broken, right? This is Romans 5 or Genesis 3, but Romans 5 captures it. Therefore, just as sin entered the world through one man and death through sin, and in this way, death came to all people because all sinned. We are beautiful and valuable, and yet broken and depraved and fallen and sinful. And that is the Christian view of what it means to be human. And man, again, take the worldview. It frames the world for us. It makes sense of this stuff. I mean, I think that those two ideas right there, image of God and the fallenness of man, makes sense of all that we see. Human beings are capable of amazing, wonderful things, building entire civilizations, creating beautiful pieces of art that just blow us away. Why can they do that? Because they're made in the image of their creator and are capable of wonderful things. And yet we also see the flip side. Human beings have done such evil, horrible things. How can they do that? How can we kill millions of other human beings? Because we're also fallen. All right. So now we're out of time for at least the presentation part, but we could take and do the same comparison with theism and atheism when it comes to morality, when it comes to meaning, when it comes to destiny. All right. And that would help then frame out the worldview, the atheistic worldview or the theistic worldview. And what we would eventually find is that these worldviews, these ideas really matter to how we live our life. In fact, if you want to know someone's worldview, one thing that you can do is simply observe their behavior, right? When it comes to human beings, what we can see is the outside. You can see me behave in certain ways. You can see my actions, and that will tell you about my worldview. Even though you can't see my worldview, you can't see my ideas, because underneath the surface, the behavior is the tip of the iceberg, but underneath the surface, that behavior is driven by values and beliefs and ideas, and ultimately a worldview, a picture of reality that will get lived out. So it's not only a worldview, it's a world and life view. Key point, ideas have consequences. Your worldview matters. Okay, I think it's a good place to stop. We'll take some questions here. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And hey, there's my co-author. I can see him now on my screen.
Hey, Brett, before we do anything else, I just thought something you said before was just so important. I needed to come back to it and make sure everybody caught that, which is, yes, I do often think that I am much smarter than you. So I just wanted to make sure everyone didn't miss that very key point that you said. Actually, there's some great questions coming in, and I'm going to try to pull them together and help Brett as he tries to answer them, and I will try to keep them coming because there's just great questions, one after another, that are pouring in. And type those questions in the Q&A box. I know there were some technical issues where some of us got kicked off a couple times in there, and I just want you to know if there's two lessons to be learned here. Number one is we're probably maxing the Zoom system. And number two, that everyone else is using Zoom. So maybe you should buy stock in Zoom. But our Elise, who's helping us with the kind of all the back processes here, actually just said she submitted a help request to Zoom just to kind of see if we can do anything to make this even more stable going forward. And she was number 560 in the Zoom queue to get her question answered. So Zoom right now is being used by a lot of people. Good news is it's a great platform, and we're still able to get a lot of content out there. The question was asked about whether you will get the rest of the slideshow on the topics not covered, and the answer is yes. You'll get that in an email by the end of the day. And also, can you share this link with others? And the answer is yes. Share the link. They can come and still sign up on the wait list, and they'll still get access to the sessions even that we've already covered. You can still kind of keep adding names to the wait list. That's not going to be a problem. So I did want everyone to know about that. Brett, a really great question that came in earlier is that, do you use worldview and religion as synonyms? For example, secularism, secular humanism would certainly be considered a worldview. Would you also consider that to be a religion?
Well, I would say worldview is the larger category, and religion would be a subset in that category. So like going back to theism is a broader category. It doesn't just capture one view, but then the individual religions would fall under that worldview. And I think that just categorizing things like that, I think helps us to kind of make sense that, hey, there's similarities here. There's, they answer some of those questions similar, but then eventually, they offer different, competing answers. So I wouldn't say worldview and religion are the same concept. Religion is a subset of that larger worldview category.
All right, great. And Somebody, Maureen wrote that I can't be smarter because I still have the white cord. And the answer is people who wear AirPods are pretentious. All right. So I'm just kidding. I have a pair of AirPods too. They're just, I'm just trying to keep I have so many Bluetooth connections going so many different directions. It just made me super nervous to add another one. So that's where that's coming from. It's another great question.
You're old.
from Missy. And you pointed some of this out. I mean, I think from goo to us would be an example, I think, of this. But what are some other words or phrases that are kind of like, oh, that's a worldview being revealed? You know, when you hear certain words or phrases or things like that, that can kind of be, I don't want to say, trigger warnings because that's a loaded phrase, but you know what I mean? That can tell us, oh, if somebody hears a worldview has been smuggled into this article or this movie or this book or, this talk or this sermon or whatever.
Well, let me just say a couple things about that. Number one, every word and every phrase has worldview implications, right? Because this is the primary way that we communicate ideas, through words. And so there's always going to be a worldview that undergirds our ideas, our phrases, our statements. And so I think what you want to listen for are the more prominent statements that you hear in a particular culture. Right. So, so for instance, let's just make this really relevant here. Like the idea of in the culture, we are using a phrase right now called, we talk about social distancing. Right. And what we want to ask is, hey, is there a worldview that drives some of that? Or just when we look at the response to the, so the mayor of New York, Mario Cuomo. Right? That's the mayor, right?
That's the mayor. Yep.
Okay, cool. Andrew's the CNN report. Okay. So Cuomo says, he makes a statement. He says, hey, we're going to do everything we're going to do everything we can. And if we do all this stuff and we just save just one life, right? Then kind of it's worth it. Well, I think that's an expression of worldview. And in this worldview, the elevation of human life to such a sacred level that's, I don't know if that's actually consistent with Christianity, that we hold on to this life as much as possible, that we could sacrifice everything just to save one life. So those are the kinds of things that I think we want to listen for. Common phrases like, a big one in our culture is "you do you," right? That's an expression of a very narcissistic, individualistic worldview that I think grows out of an atheistic, secularist worldview, right? Because at the end of the day, there's no transcendent creator who I owe my allegiance to, who's the center of the universe. At the end of the day, become the center of the universe. My existence is all I really care about. You do you, I'll do me, kind of thing. And that has implications for meaning and morality. So I think the key idea here is that worldview is constantly communicated through our words and our actions. And so this is why it's important for us to be students of the culture, to kind of listen to the culture, to see what's going on, and to look at what are some of the undercurrents, these ideas that are undergirding all the ideas in our culture.
Yeah. Hey, some good fact checkers here. And I knew this was going to happen as soon as you were like, wait, is that true? Is that now Andrew Cuomo, according to Colleen Springer, as we know, she's right. Andrew Cuomo is the governor of New York. De Blasio is the mayor.
Sorry, governor. Yes, that's right. Governor.
Yeah,
Sorry.
I knew that.
Thank you.
Sure, Brett.
I knew that, man. Okay. Come on. I'm intelligent.
Hey, but along those lines, though, it's not that, and I want you to speak a little bit more to this, because this idea of even human dignity that most people take for granted, that you hear even secularists use that phrase, but that's not a concept that really makes sense within a world that is survival of the fittest, right?
Exactly.
And Breakpoint is that, like, that song imagine this brotherhood of man when there's no heaven and nobody up above you and everything, nothing but sky. It's basically a Stein Bears, what you can't get a concept of like universal human dignity out of that worldview, but people who have that worldview embrace it. So talk through the inconsistency.
Yes. Okay, so this is where you see the inconsistency of their worldview. So there's multiple ways to test whether or not a worldview is actually true. Number one, you could call the test of correspondence. Does the worldview match up with reality? Does it correspond to reality? And that's one way we know that our worldview is true or false, if it fits with the nature of reality. Another way is to look at consistency, right? So you test a worldview. So you may have a coherent story that helps you describe reality, or you may see inconsistencies. And those inconsistencies can be in the ideas. And so, for instance, the idea that the macroevolutionary story is our origin story. We come from nothing, by nothing, for nothing. And then someone also holds this view that, and we all have equal value and dignity. And what we can show is, hey, those are inconsistent ideas in your worldview. And that's where you kind of put some pressure on that worldview to say, look, that's not adequate, because you can't, from your larger answers to the large questions, you can't get this thing over here. In fact, there's a deep connection between the origin question and the identity question. Where you come from tells you so much about who you are and what you are, or whose you are, right? And so, so those are deeply connected. And so what we'd point to in the atheist worldview is to say, hey, if you're an atheist, if you're a secularist, if you're someone who doesn't hold to a view that there's a personal creator of the universe who's made us in his image, well, then where do you get equal human value? There's no basis for that. It's inconsistent. Now, here's now going back to that correspondence test, right? Here's where every human being, we can't get away from reality. And so there's a reality that we know is that some people are more in tune with this than others, but there's this sense of, well, no, I know everyone's equal, that no matter what your race is or your gender, no, we all have equal value. And so they can affirm that even though they don't have a basis for that, because they have to live in reality. And then you help people see, hey, that's inconsistent with your worldview. That actually fits better in the Christian worldview. The Christian worldview can actually give you a rational explanation for that. So,
yeah, a good transition here. There's questions about how to bring up worldview sorts of conversations with non-believers, right? I mean, it's hard enough with other believers sometimes, but pointing out these consistencies, obviously people love it when you point out inconsistencies in their own belief system. So maybe give us some strategies, a couple strategies or two. I know we've got a couple in the book that we've used, but talk about how to have these worldview conversations with non-believers.
Yeah, my recommendation, I think our recommendation, is always start with questions. In fact, the book on this that we all promote is Tactics by Greg Kunkle, my former boss at Stand to Reason. That book is fantastic, just the stuff he does on questions. Learn to ask really good questions. That is the best way to jump into these conversations. Number one, I think the benefit, number one, is that it helps you to take a real interest in someone else, to listen to someone else first before you speak. Because a lot of times, I think we have this posture that, well, I know the truth and I'm supposed to share the truth. And so we are very anxious to want to get the truth out there. But if you just talk and don't do any listening, then there's this sense where, people will pick up on that. You just want to hear yourself speak. You don't care about what I think. And so by starting with questions, you really take some time to take interest in that person and to really find out what their worldview is. So, two of the big questions you ask, and every one of us can do this without any training. The first question is, well, what do you mean by that? And of course, there's lots of different versions of this. Someone could be wearing a religious symbol, and you could say, hey, what is that? What does that mean? That's a form of the question. Well, what do you mean by that? Or someone has a book that they're reading, and you see the book and you're like, hey, what's that book about? Well, tell me more about that book. Or someone goes to they go to some event and you go, hey, what was that event about? Or what was that lecture about you went to? All kinds of things where you're just observing things, and you ask a question, hey, tell me more about that. What is that? What do you mean by that? And that's a clarification question. You're just trying to gather more information at that point. And of course, people love when you ask them questions, and they get to share a little bit about themselves. And then the second question you ask, the follow-up question, as you gain more information, is you ask, well, you start hearing their claims or their worldview. You start asking them the question, well, now, why do you believe that? Or how did you come to that conclusion? That maybe they're wearing a certain religious symbol. I think that we are all part of this larger grand scheme that we all fit together, and kind of maybe they start expressing a pantheistic worldview, kind of a new age worldview. And then you then begin to ask them, well, why do you think that? Why do you think that we're all part of God? And that right there will launch you into lots of good questions or good conversations by asking questions.
The title of the book, again, that Brett just recommended, and by the way, when we send out the follow-up email tonight, we'll link to this. In fact, this book was the resource of the month from the Colson Center, I think last month, and we might even still have that link live, and so we'll include that if we've got it, but it's called Tactics, Tactics, Tactics by Greg Kunkle, not to be confused with Kunkle. That's this guy. Kunkle is Koukl. But again, we'll send you that link as well as any of the other resources that Brett mentioned. There's just a ton of great questions. We only got just a few minutes left, but I want to make sure I get to this one because it really is kind of nuts and bolts. So try to answer this one quick, Brett, and then we can get to this one more, which I think is really important. Why is Christianity not considered pantheistic if we believe God created everything? And this is a really important distinction to make.
Yeah, so it's the view that God made all. That's Christian theism. God made all. Pantheism is the view that God is all. So when pantheism, what you lose from Christianity is the creator-creature distinction or creator-world distinction. There's, in Christianity, God makes all, but he's not the same thing as all of that. He is distinct. He is transcendent. And we are distinct. We have our own personal identity. I have my own personal soul. In pantheism, it's all, at the end of the day, it's all one and the same. There is no distinction at the end of the day. So that would be the simple definition or explanation.
So I'm going to combine two questions here and give you a resource. One of the questions is, what's of those five worldview questions, is there one that's more important than others? Right now in our culture? And I'm going to say identity, and it's going to go with this other question, which is when you were talking about identity and human value, Brett, somebody else typed in a question like, hey, this is relevant right now. And I was literally working on an email or one of my breakpoint commentaries while you were talking, no offense, but kind of multitasking, but specifically talking about, and this will come out on the radio and on our email list tomorrow. In Italy, we have seen the requirement where they've had to ration healthcare. They had to choose. Am I going to treat an older person who that has a lower chance of survival when we don't have enough hospital beds and resources and ventilators, or am I going to treat a younger one with a higher chance of survival? And, crises like these make these questions very, very, very relevant. But we've also got to say, in California, where you live, Colorado, where I live, Washington State, Oregon, we've already made that decision that some lives lose their dignity when they're old, when they're terminally ill, when they're disabled for various reasons. We've seen this in Belgium and Canada and so on. These are very, very relevant questions.
Yeah. And I would say this, I wouldn't say that, that we'd characterize it as one question's more important than another question, but we would say that maybe one is more primary in the cultural conversation. So the identity question is front and center in the culture. Of course, there's all the stuff on gender identity, but then these issues that John has brought up here, death with dignity, euthanasia, these kinds of things. These are all issues of identity. But what we want to always see is that the puzzle pieces connect. And this is why it's so important. So this is where I think worldview thinking is helpful, is that in the culture, we want to, as Christians, address the identity question. But ultimately, we're going to, in order to be most effective, we're going to have to connect that back to the origin question. I think the more and more people that become godless or don't believe in God or think God is somehow irrelevant in our culture, the more difficulty we're going to have in trying to lay a foundation of human dignity for them that's consistent with the Christian worldview, the proper view of human dignity, the proper view of identity. And so this is why, a lot of sociologists talk about the rise of the nuns. These are not N-U-N-S, but the N-O-N-E-S. These are people who identify that they have no religious affiliation. And so many of those folks, either God's totally irrelevant or they don't believe in God. And as we see this, and so that's whether they've thought through it carefully or not, that's going to be part of their answer to the origin question. Well, that's going to flow right into the identity question, how they answer the identity question, and what answers seem plausible to them, or what explanations seem that make sense to them. So if we come in with this idea that, hey, we're all made in the image of God, of course, that's not going to be very plausible. Or if we say, hey, we all have equal value, and their worldview is a godless worldview that doesn't allow them to really kind of consider this, or it's not consistent ultimately with this, then it's going to just be more difficult for us. So yes, there are questions that come to the surface or come to the forefront in the culture, but I think it's important to see this deep connection between those questions. And I think so. The origin question is such a fundamental question. It flows into the other questions in very deep ways.
Determining right now our morality question too. So when we send out the resources tonight, we'll send out this video, we'll send out the Q&A, we'll send out Brett's PowerPoint presentation, including any slides that he didn't get to will be in that as well. And also we'll add links to various resources. And one of those is dealing with these immediate situations that we're facing, and these fundamental questions about God and identity and morality. Heidi, let's send out the commentary that we did last week on the song Imagine. You might have seen that a group of celebrities sang Imagine together as a way to encourage people in the coronavirus. And it's a great way to kind of get to the lyrics of that song and show how it fell short. Well, you got something else to say, Brett?
Yeah, I thought I'd close with a Kuyper quote.
Okay.
But yeah, okay. So there's a great way, I think, to kind of wrap up all that we're saying here. Abraham Kuyper was a Dutch theologian, and he's got this beautiful quote that really captures the all-encompassing truth of the Christian worldview. And this is what he says. He says, "There is not a square inch in the whole domain of our human existence over which Christ, who is sovereign over all, does not cry, mine, mine." And that's the idea that all truth. So this goes back to that Colossians chapter 2 verse. Do you really believe that in Christ are hidden all the treasures of wisdom and knowledge? If you have a full, consistent Christian worldview, you can say yes to that, because you realize that there's not a square inch of reality that doesn't belong to Jesus. All knowledge is hidden in Jesus, and that is consistent. And that is what it means to have a Christian worldview.
And tomorrow, Sean McDowell is going to be with us leading this session, and he's going to talk about how to ground your worldview in Christ through the Scriptures and the authority of Scripture. And this is one of the great intersections of our current culture and worldview. We have a culture in which, and if you talk about in the book, an age of information where ideas are flying around all over the place. And so it creates a crisis of trust. And so how is the Bible a more reliable source than Google or anything else that we have in our cultural experience? And so that's what Sean is going to do tomorrow. Brett's going to be back with us on Thursday to talk. In fact, are you hosting tomorrow? I think you're hosting tomorrow. So
I'll talk to Sean. He's probably going to need my help.
He needs some help, just like you needed help today. Notice I'm the only one that did it by myself. Thursday, Brett's going to be back to teach on technology and issues, and we're going to pivot from worldview really into the issues of our culture. Technology on Thursday, sexuality on Friday. Thanks for joining us. We'll get this out to you just as soon as we can. Thanks for being patient on the technology. We're doing our best. Hopefully Zoom's doing their best too. But we'll get this to you as soon as we can. We'll see you tomorrow. Thanks, guys.
See you, everybody.